Welcome to the second International Paget's Awareness Day, which marks the 206th anniversary of Sir James Paget's birth. The Paget's Association is the only UK charity dedicated to adult Paget's disease. It provides information on Paget's disease for patients, for their carers and for healthcare professionals. It is dedicated to raising awareness of the condition and also supports research into Paget's disease. We're filming today at Norton Priory. Now, Norton Priory is situated in the northwest of England, which was and still is a hotspot for Paget's disease. And the reason we're filming here is that researchers from the Paget's Association have found some fascinating evidence about the natural history of Paget's disease based on skeletons which were found at this location.
So thank you to Stuart Ralston for his introduction to the International Paget's Day. In our next presentation we'll hear from Lynn Smith, who's a senior keeper here at Norton Priory. And Lynn is really the person who brought the unusual skeletal disorder here at Norton Priory to the attention of the research community and the Paget's Association, and has been the person who's helped coordinate lots of the research into the unusual bone disease that you're going to hear more about throughout the rest of this presentation.
Norton Priory was originally excavated from 1970 through to 1987, and during those excavations they were looking for the main monastic Augustinian complex with the church and the cloister as the main sections of investigation. But during the work they actually discovered quite a lot of burials, medieval burials. In total, I think with charnel deposits as well as interments, there's about 168 individuals, but 130 of those individuals are articulated skeletons, and they tell a very detailed history of the different sorts of trauma and diseases that were seen in the medieval population at Norton Priory. In 2008 we had a review of the whole of the archaeological collection here at Norton, and scientists at Bradford University discovered that out of those 130 skeletons, 6 adult males were displaying symptoms or signs, I should say, of a Paget's-like disease, which was quite an unusual and a very high percentage in an archaeological collection. We're always very keen to try and find out more about all of the variety of finds in our collection, but because these 6 adult males were particularly interesting, we've managed to hook up with a variety of different researchers, both university and hospital-based researchers, to try and find out a little bit more about what the significance of this Paget's-like disease was and why Norton Priory should have such a high percentage of individuals in the collection with the problem. The Norton Priory Museum Trust is governed by a board of trustees, and they are very supportive of all of the research that we do with people like the Paget's Association, Nottingham University and John Moores University, because I think they understand the importance of having a research framework for a small organisation such as Norton Priory. Personally, I believe it's exceptional that a small independent charity such as Norton Priory is able to work not only with the detail of these different research organisations, but to the extent and the close engagement that we've had is both outstanding and definitely a career highlight for me. Well, we know that in the medieval period the northwest of England was a hotspot for a Paget's-like disease, and we also know in the 21st century that the northwest of England still has a predisposition for having this bone condition, and several other archaeological sites in the northwest have shown evidence, macroscopic evidence, of individuals from the medieval period having Paget's-like disease, one of them being in Chester and the other one being in Poulton, which is just outside of Chester.
So Lynn's given us an overview of the history of Norton Priory and an indication of the Norton Priory collection of skeletons that have been unearthed here from medieval times. We'll now move on and hear about some of the research that's been carried out on these remains to try and understand the disease-like changes, the Paget's-like changes that are evident in them, and to try and diagnose accurately what the particular condition was that was affecting these individuals in medieval times. So Dr. Carla Burrell, an osteoarchaeologist from Leiden University, will now tell us a little about her work using visual macroscopic analyses and also X-ray analyses to study the changes in the skeletal remains and the unusual features that her work has revealed in the Norton Priory collection.
Okay, so as an archaeologist, we just study the bones of past populations, so especially people from the Roman period right through to the post-medieval period. So of these skeletons in particular, we've got a large number of individuals who have several bones affected in their skeletons with this disease. They have very thickened and large bones that show signs that are very typical of PAGET'S disease. To take a look at this information in more detail, to look at these marks and changes, we've done X-ray analysis of these bones as well, to see the internal changes and the macroscopic changes more in detail. Particular looking for distinct features of PAGET'S disease to help with the clarification of that. So you see a lot of porosity, a lot of coral-like changes to the surface of the bone in areas that are quite highly affected. Sometimes they appear quite enlarged and swollen in comparison to healthy counterparts. And in extreme cases, we do have examples of like secondary osteoarthritis that we can see in the bone as well when this disease is quite advanced. So with the femur bone now, we've taken the X-ray of the same bone, and we can see internally this flame, or a lytic wedge as such, progressing down the bone itself and leaving the trail of the swollen macroscopic change that we can see externally. We can see that internally through this X-ray analysis, but what we can see is that progressive change internally, which we can't see with the naked eye. At this moment in time, Norton seems very unique. It seems to be like a distinct hotspot in the northwest of the UK. There's quite a large number of individuals here affected for such a small population group. And when we look at other archaeological collections across the UK and even in Europe, there's only 1 or 2 cases reported from any given site. However, that doesn't mean that there are more skeletons, it's just the research not been done as in depth as we have done here at Norton.
As part of the research, we wanted to characterize the lifestyles of the individuals in Norton Priory, particularly because there is from 130 skeletons, about 35% got evidence of PAGET'S disease. So we wanted to know if there was anything in their lifestyles that perhaps was associated with the fact that they had the disease. So to do that, what we did is we took a sample of a molar, extracted the molar from the mandible of different individuals, and so far we have studied 18 different individuals from the collection in Norton Priory. And what we did then with the molar, we took it, cut it in half. The roots were sent for radiocarbon dating because we wanted to know what was the age of these individuals when they were living. And the crown of the teeth were used to then say where they were originally, the geographical point of origin. Because why there is this very large incidence of PAGET'S in Norton Priory? Are these people local to the immediate area around the priory, or are they coming from further away in the whole of the country, and there was a reason why they were concentrating here? So with this information, we send the teeth away to be studied, and what we are doing basically is looking to the chemical signatures that are stored in the teeth. What is very interesting is when you are eating any different types of food, if you are a vegetarian, if you are a carnivore, all of that is being recorded in your teeth. And then we can take this information, measure the amount of carbon isotope and nitrogen isotope that are remaining in your teeth, and then we can reconstruct what was the paleo diet of these people. What is very interesting is as part of the results, there is a very high incidence of people with very high values of nitrogen. And this is telling us that there was quite a lot of consumption of fish at the time that they were living. And we need to remember that this is a priory, probably there is a lot of fasting going, but we know that at the time, in medieval times, fish was not considered to be part of a sort of carnivore diet. So probably that's one of the reasons why there is a lot of fish that we can now identify from the signatures in the teeth. The other thing we did then with the crowns, we measured the amounts of strontium and oxygen isotope that were stored in these teeth, and what we find is that in general, the individuals that were buried in Norton Priory are relatively local. The big majority are local to the immediate area. Maybe just 1 or 2 that come perhaps from Wales, the northern part of Wales, maybe from the Cheshire Basin. Why we know this information? Because when you are drinking water, when you are eating vegetables or animals that grow on the soil, we are extracting the signature, the chemical signature from the soil and the water, and all of this is recorded in your teeth. So with this we can put a picture, a general picture of the population that is recorded in Norton Priory, and we know that they were, in some cases, with very high social status. Why we know that? Because we compare some of the results, particularly the carbon and the nitrogen, with respect to other individuals in the medieval period. So for example, we compare it with Richard III and with some bishops in Scotland that were very high social status, and some of the individuals, like for example, skeleton 101, we know that got chemical signatures that are similar to these very high social status individuals, which means that this is putting a picture of the prairie at the time. You know, the type of people that were living, eating fish, having all these prey, etc., relatively close to the area, and finally to be buried in Norton Priory. The next stage in the research is going a little bit beyond this, and now we got a grant from the PAGET'S Association to continue with the study of 18 individuals, and for that we are going to do similar studies in terms of paleodiet reconstruction and the geographical origin for these individuals, but then we are going to do genomic studies together with Pontus Skoglund from the Francis Crick Institute in London. And this is going to be the first time that we are going to attempt something like that in medieval individuals. And the other thing we are doing currently at the moment is there are some ongoing excavations in Norton Priory that are being done by Liverpool University. And I got a group of students that are taking soil samples to try to determine if there is any elements in the soil, particularly during medieval times, that perhaps are triggering Paget's disease. This is still ongoing. The excavations already have been happening during the last 2 years during the summers. And then I got the students that are doing undergraduate dissertations, and they are studying what is the chemical compositions of the soils. And we already know that, for example, for soils that were in the 18th century, there is very large concentrations of lead. So the next stage of the research is going to look as well into the lead composition in the teeth to see if we can see that there is some similarities with very high values of heavy metals, lead, copper, zinc, etc. So this is still ongoing. So this is exciting because this research keeps going. And we are very grateful to the PAGET'S Association because they are supporting all of this research. And without their support, this couldn't happen at all.
So we've heard about some of the macroscopic and X-ray analyses of the skeletal remains in the Norton Priory collection that suggest an atypical or an unusual form of Paget's disease. In the next presentation, Dr. Anna Daroszewska from the University of Liverpool, who's also a practicing physician in the Paget's field, will talk about in more detail some of the similarities and differences of those skeletal changes of the modern form of disorder compared to the ancient.
Okay, so here in Norton, the condition which we call atypical Paget's disease, or the ancient variant of Paget's disease, has several similarities to modern-day Paget's disease, but there are also significant differences. So with regard to similarities, we can observe enlargement of the bone, which is very typical of Paget's disease, and on X-rays we can see thickening of the bone cortex and also mottled bone structure inside. So we have to remember that in modern day clinical practice we have other tools at our disposal, such as isotope bone scans and blood tests that can aid the diagnosis of Paget's disease. So for example, the isotope bone scan will tell us about the activity and also the extent of Paget's disease, and on blood tests we can assess bone turnover markers, and typically they would be expected to be elevated. Now, of course, here we do not have those tools available, so all we can rely on is the expertise of the archaeologists, observation, and of course X-rays. And there is another caveat here with regard to X-rays. These X-rays of the skeletal remains, which have been buried for centuries, they can give quite a different appearance to X-rays taken on live individuals, of course. So there is a bit of a difficulty interpreting the findings. But having said all that, as I mentioned, there are several similarities to modern-day Paget's disease, such as bone thickening and some X-ray findings suggesting that this is indeed Paget's disease. With regard to differences, interestingly, the ancient form of Paget's disease, or this atypical Paget's disease, is characterized by quite extensive involvement of the skeleton, as though up to 75% of the skeleton has been found to be affected, and that is unusual in modern Paget's disease. Another difference is the involvement of certain skeletal areas. So in modern Paget's disease, we would typically expect the involvement of weight-bearing bones, such as the long bones, also the pelvis and the vertebrae. And indeed, we see this involvement in the skeletons here in Norton. However, unusually, there is also an involvement of the fibula, which is the non-weight-bearing bone, which is the slim bone present to the side of the tibia in the lower leg. So we can't really explain this very well. Another difference is the prevalence of this condition here in the skeletal remains, as it has been estimated to be up to 16%, whereas nowadays the prevalence is between 1 to 2%, and that is of the adult individuals. Another difference is the age of the affected individuals. The estimated age seems to be quite low, less than the age of 50, and in some cases even age of 35, whereas nowadays Paget's disease affects mostly older individuals over the age of 50 or 55. And finally, in spite of the extensive skeletal involvement with this condition, we see relatively little in the way of complications such as secondary osteoarthritis or indeed deformities. So we would normally expect quite significant deformities in severe Paget's disease, and that is not seen here, and we are not sure as to why. It may be an environmental factor that has modified this condition, or some other factor which we are still yet to discover.
In the next presentation, Professor Rob van 't Hoff from the University of Liverpool talks about the application of state-of-the-art imaging approaches to look at the Paget's-like changes within the ancient bones in much greater detail.
But what we can see, and I've got a scan here of a fibula, right? On the left-hand side is a sample from Norton Priory with Paget's disease, and on the right-hand side is another medieval sample from Meanan Abbey in northern Wales. What you can see here, that Norton sample has got a very thickened shaft, what we call the cortex of the bone, right? Much thicker than what you can see in the sample from Meanan Abbey. And the second thing that we can do, and that we can only see that because of this very high resolution, if you look inside that cortical structure, you can see it's very porous. It looks different from that sample from Meanan Abbey. Now these spores probably in life mostly contain blood vessels. And that is something that is very characteristic of Paget's disease. You get porous bone with lots of blood vessels in there. So what we're doing at the moment is we're doing scans of a number of skeletons and skeletal elements by clinical CT and by micro CT. And what we're doing is we're comparing those to medieval samples of a population without Paget's disease, right, which is the Meanan Abbey population from northern Wales, not far away from here. But we also want to compare these with clinical CT scans of actual current classic Paget's disease cases. So by comparing these different samples, we hope to understand better what is typical and maybe not so typical about the Paget's disease at Norton Priory.
So it's evident then that there's something really unusual about this Paget's-like disorder that's affecting so many skeletons here in the Norton Priory collection. It's extensive, it affects individuals at a young age, but there's very little evidence of the complications that we often see associated with contemporary or modern Paget's disease. And that really leads to the question, was this really a form of Paget's disease, or is this some other unusual bone disease that really hadn't been diagnosed? And that's where research in my laboratory came in. So we're a molecular research lab. We study the molecules which make living cells and living organisms, and our particular interest is in proteins. So proteins are one type of molecule that are the functional entities of cells. We as humans have maybe 100,000 different proteins, and we assume that after death, after we pass away, that those proteins are pretty unstable. We think of ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and the molecules that make us up disappear. But research over the past 5 to 10 years has actually challenged that notion and has shown that some proteins are remarkably stable, and they persist in skeletons after death for hundreds, maybe thousands, possibly millions of years. And they seem to do that by becoming associated with bones, with the skeleton, and somehow bones and other calcified tissues like teeth have this ability to preserve ancient proteins. This is something that was completely unexpected. So we wondered whether we would be able to analyse the ancient bones here in the Norton Priory collection and look for evidence of ancient proteins that might point towards a diagnosis, a precise molecular diagnosis of the disease. And so we set out with this analysis with support from the Paget's Association and in collaboration with Norton Priory, and we were amazed. We were actually able to recover intact proteins from skeletal remains over 800 years old. Now, not only could we extract these proteins, but when we analysed them, we realised that their sequences or their signatures were identical to those signatures that characterise modern-day Paget's disease. And all of this then was pointing to the fact that this is an ancient form of Paget's disease that's very different here at Norton Priory, completely different features to what we see today, but at the molecular level it's the same disorder. So there's something very unusual, something atypical about the disease here at Norton Priory, but most certainly it is a form of Paget's disease. And our molecular analyses then of the ancient proteins preserved here in the Norton Priory collection has been backed up by other work from colleagues at the University of East Anglia, again funded by the Paget's Association, who have analysed a different type of ancient molecule called microRNAs. Once again, it was assumed that these microRNAs would be highly unstable, but it turns out from their work that microRNAs are also preserved in skeletal remains. And by analysing microRNAs from samples of the Norton Priory collection, and in particular some of the advanced complications of those skeletons, the microRNA signatures also precisely match those microRNA signatures that we see in contemporary Paget's patients today. So together, the imaging analysis that's entirely consistent with Paget's-like changes that we see today, but also the molecular analysis really does point to a sound diagnosis of ancient Paget's disease. And this is something that hasn't been described previously. So this is a real breakthrough, if you will. It tells us about the natural history of Paget's disease. It tells us that the disease may have been very common in medieval times. It certainly seemed to be common at this site here in the northwest of England. And it then leads to the question, why was the disease so common? So it gives us an opportunity then to try and understand ancient Paget's disease that might be relevant for understanding what's going on in the disease that affects individuals still today. We've heard about the research that's gone on here in combination with Norton Priory and the Paget's Association that's established that actually this was an ancient, unusual form of Paget's disease here in medieval times in the northwest of England. In the next presentation, Lynn Smith talks about the idea that perhaps Norton Priory was some sort of referral centre, an ancient hospital perhaps, or somewhere where individuals came to or referred to try and be treated for different conditions they were affected. And we'll think about the different treatments that might have been available, such as herbal remedies.
We think that there may be a very special element to the Augustinian foundation here at Norton Priory. We know the Augustinians had a duty of care for the sick and the infirm, and we're currently searching archaeologically for the infirmary. But there's a possibility with the high percentage of individuals in the collection with this Paget's-like disease that the Augustinians have become quite specialised in treating the different symptoms that perhaps generations were presenting with at Norton Priory. And we also know that most monastic places would have had a herb garden to be able to treat people with different herbal tinctures or different treatments or poultices, for example. And we have actually recreated a medieval style herb garden on site to give visitors a sense of what that would look like. Although we are still investigating it, that because there are so many people locally that could have been displaying symptoms associated with this Paget's-like disease, that the Augustinians over the centuries have become quite familiar with treating the different symptoms that people had. So it's a possibility that Norton Priory could have been a specialised sort of healthcare centre or even perhaps a hospice, that kind of facility. Obviously no NHS, so a medieval equivalent of.
Paget's disease wasn't studied until my great-great-grandfather, Sir James Paget, did so in the 1800s. However, research carried out here at Norton Priory and other research clearly shows that it was around much earlier.
So clearly there's something highly unusual about the Paget's disease affecting skeletons here in the Norton Priory collection. But what can we learn from our observations? What can we learn from the research on these ancient skeletons and apply that knowledge to Paget's patients today? So in the next section, Professor Ralston will think about the implications of this research and more broadly think about how they could inform our understanding of Paget's disease moving forward in the future.
Well, the research you've heard about today is interesting. Although the Paget's disease, or the form of Paget's disease, was very extensive, there are some puzzling features. For example, there was no deformity, wasn't very much in the way of osteoarthritis or wear and tear in the joints. And so if we understood more why that was, it could give some insights into helping us prevent bone deformity or arthritis, which are common complications of Paget's disease in the modern time. Well, the disease that you've heard about today is quite different from the disease we see as clinicians nowadays. So something has changed. We don't know if that was a rapid change that occurred over a short period of time or a gradual change over the years, but finding out more of that can, I think, give us really interesting insights into the cause of this condition. The Paget's disease that you've heard about was very extensive, and obviously many people in this priory were affected by it. Now we know that family history or genetic factors are important in Paget's, and it could be that the people that had the disease were related and perhaps may have inherited some genetic predisposition to the disease. Other factors may also have played a role. Obviously in those days there was a lot more in the way of physical activity or mechanical loading of the skeleton. That could be another factor, but to be honest, we're not exactly sure, emphasizing the importance of doing more research on this fascinating condition. Many environmental factors have been implicated in Paget's disease. For example, vitamin D deficiency, if you're not taking enough calcium in your diet during childhood, viral infections. I think it's fair to say, though, at the moment, we don't really know how environmental factors and genetics interact to cause Paget's disease or affect the severity, and that's an important direction for the association moving forward.
So in our final presentation, Professor Terence O'Neill from Manchester is going to tell us about the epidemiology of Paget's disease, and particularly events that have happened in more recent human history, so changes that have occurred within the past 50 years. And these changes are particularly profound in the northwest of England, of course the site of Norton Priory Museum.
Our current best estimates, based on the results of a survey in the early 1990s, are that about 1 in 50 people over the age of 50 years in the UK have evidence of Paget's disease of bone, and that amounts to just under 500,000 people. The disease seems to affect men more frequently than women and increases in frequency with age. One of the really intriguing aspects about Paget's disease is that it seems to vary in different parts of the UK by a factor of up to 2 to 4-fold. And data from several studies suggest that it's most frequent in the northwest of England. And in the most recent survey, the areas with the highest frequency were Warrington, Wigan and Lancaster. One of the other intriguing aspects about Paget's disease is that it seems to have declined in frequency over the past 50 years. And so a survey in the early 1970s suggested at that time that the frequency was twice as high as the results of the more recent survey. And so at that time, about 1 in 20 men and women were affected by the disease. Research which has been supported by the Paget's Association suggests that the decrease in frequency of the disease is continuing at least into the early part of this century. And certainly that is consistent with my own experience as a clinical rheumatologist who sees patients with Paget's disease. And over the past 20 years, the number of new people that I've been seeing has decreased, and also the severity of the disease has declined also. So we don't know the reason for this geographic difference in occurrence or the decline in frequency, but it seems much more plausibly to be related to change in some form of unknown environmental trigger rather than any change in the underlying susceptibility or genetic susceptibility or predisposition to the disease. One of the aims of the Paget's Association is to support and fund research. And over the years, the Paget's Association has really made significant contribution to advancing knowledge of Paget's disease with support for groundbreaking basic and clinical research, including a number of clinical trials which have impacted and improved in a very beneficial way on patient care. The association continues to support research, including projects such as the project which is going on at the Norton Priory looking at archaeological specimens, and also encouraging younger researchers into the field through the award of student bursaries.
So how do you find out more about Paget's disease today? Well, Diana Wilkinson, who's the specialist nurse at the Paget's Association, will tell us a little bit about the work of the association, the research it supports, and in particular the support it can offer to patients, to carers, to families and to members as well.
It can sometimes be an uphill struggle for anyone affected by Paget's disease of bone today. Just to obtain a diagnosis can be difficult. Pain is the most common reason for someone with the condition to visit their GP, and of course GPs really want to help, but with a whole list of possibilities, Paget's disease is often not considered soon enough. The Paget's Association is a charity raising awareness of the condition and seeking out the people who really need our help. We also encourage and fund quality research into many aspects of Paget's disease, which will ultimately benefit patients. The 11th of January each year is International Paget's Awareness Day, so please help us by putting the date on your calendar, by talking about Paget's disease and by sharing information on social media. Our website is a really good resource for facts about the condition, including a clinical guideline, news about the latest research, details about funding for research grants, student bursaries and our new educational award. And of course, you will find details of our support services, including our nurse helpline. So do visit our website at www.paget.org.uk.
So if you're interested in hearing more about Paget's disease, don't hesitate to get in touch. Contact details are all on the website. Thank you.